Welcome dart players one and all. Today on Straight to the Point we're going to be talking about darts, specifically how to pick the right set for yourself. Now this is aimed for people who either struggle to stick to a set or have never bought a set. Maybe you're buying for someone else. But choosing a dart and sticking with it can be quite difficult. Especially when you start playing well with one set, you have a bit of a honeymoon period, and then all of a sudden you start to go a bit downhill, then you pick another set up, and then you start playing well again, and then you go back to your old set. We've all been there. Now there are a few things to consider when picking a dart. We need to look at the weight of the dart, the shape of the dart, the length of the dart, so the balance becomes very important, and that's affected by the weight and the shape of the dart. That's another thing to consider, the shape of the dart. The grip. There's lots of them out there, to be fair. And then we need to look at the setup with the dart as well. Your flights, your shafts, your points. It's quite a lot when you think about it. Before we get into all of that though, we're going to talk about tungsten percentage. Because people don't really think about this a lot. But if you've never bought a dart, it's important to know about tungsten percentage. Tungsten percentage is really important to understand because the material is quite different. If you're going for a basic standard ring grip dart, something like this. That's an original Martin Adams dart. Now this is 90% tungsten. Now that dart is nearly 20-year-old and it's in mint condition. And that is because it doesn't have a lot of grip to wear away anyway. And it's also 90% tungsten, which lasts a lot better than 80%. 95% also lasts very long. After 95 it gets a little bit brittle and it starts to snap. This is 80% tungsten with a lot of grip. And if you look at that, that is really worn down. And that was only used for about 2 or 3 weeks. If I get a brand new version of that dart and compare it right next to each other, there's a big difference. You can see most of the colours come off it. The grip is very blunt. So if you're ever having a dart made like this, where it's got lots of fine grip, you really want 90% tungsten. Next thing we're going to talk about is the shape. Now most players prefer a dart similar to this, just long, straight, classic design. This is what most players are going to use. If you're starting out, this is what you want to start with, something like this. This dart plays quite flat. You can also kick the dart in the air. There's plenty on my channel about how to get the darts to land upright in the board. Compared to this, so this is more of a John Lowe style dart. Very, very round, very, very short. These are your two main darts. These are the most popular out there. Something like this, something like that. Now with this dart, there's a couple of pros to it and a couple of cons to it. It's very easy to grip. If you grip a dart like so, a bit like a pen, it's kind of hard to grip it wrong. You're likely to pick the dart up the same every time with this. However, it is a little bit chunkier. So especially if you like a heavier version of this dart, this is only 21 grams. If I go heavier, it's going to be quite bulbous because the dart is so short. In more recent times, darts like this have become very popular. This is a very interesting design. O'Connor uses a set very much like this. Firstly, it's got a big taper at the front. So if it hits another dart, it's likely to go right up against it rather than bounce out. Very useful for hitting 180s. Secondly, it also has a scallop just by here. So a little bit like the John Lowe darts, you pretty much have to grip these in the same place every time. Not great if you hold the front with that taper, very, very slippery, but if I hold it right to the back on the shaft, I've still got the scallop with the second finger. 99% of players are going to put their thumb in that scallop. So you've got something to push against. And if you struggle to pick the dart up, a scallop can be very, very useful. I always like a scallop, but on my darts, my signature darts, I've always opted for a rear taper. It does pretty much the same thing. I only put the grip where my finger goes, and I've got that scallop to push against. So as long as my first finger and thumb are on that scallop, I hold it pretty much the same each time. Now in terms of balance, you have to ask yourself, do you want a straight barrel, which is normally weighted somewhere in the centre, or something very front heavy? So you can see there's less mass on the back of this dart, all the weight is by here. So this shape is generally going to be a lot more front heavy than this shape. And in contrast, this dart's going to be the opposite. The rear is heavy because the mass is at the back of the dart. If you want your darts to sit upright in the dartboard, a front heavy dart can be a bit easier. However, there is an exception to this, and that is how you grip the dart. If you're gripping the dart right at the front and you use a very straight barrel dart, that's going to fly pretty flat unless I flick the point. Some players do that, like Gary Anderson. Very tricky to do though. If I hold it in the centre, it's going to be fairly flat, but it might lift a little bit. So it'll leave the hand slightly like this, kick up and land like that in the board. If I go to the back, now all the weight of the dart is by here. It's in front of my grip. Even if I put a few stabilisers on, so I'm putting the other fingers on touching lightly, all the weight's still at the front of the dart. So now it plays like a front heavy dart. Now, could you imagine if I used this shape, but as long as this, and then held it at the back? I would have a massive amount of weight at the front. It would be hard to not make them land up at the board. But that would be a little bit overkill probably. So if you hold the dart at the back, you don't want anything bulbous at the front unless it's short. Otherwise there's probably going to be a bit too much weight at the front for you. If I hold the dart at the front, if I want the dart to land flat, stick to something this shape, something classic and plain. If I want the dart to land upright and I hold it at the front, and I don't want to flick that point, which most of us don't, you might want something a bit shorter, with a longer shaft and a bigger flight. And finally, in terms of the weight of the dart, you do have to try them, to be fair, but you can normally adjust, give or take a few grams. So for myself, I can use anything from 21 grams to 23. After 23, it gets a little bit heavy for me. I feel like I'm struggling to adapt after that point. But you can give or take a few grams. Most players tend to use around 22. So if you're starting off, try and get a set of 22 or 23 grams. That's pretty much middle of the range. I believe it was Red Dragon that released a stat a few years ago saying that amateurs are more likely to buy a 22 set over any other weight. And when you look at what professionals are using, they're normally between 20 and 26. 23, right in the middle. I've always liked 23, 22s. They're my favourite weights. In terms of adapting to the weight though, as a general rule, the lighter the dart, the faster your wrist and fingers need to be moving at the point of release. A little bit like Stephen Bunting, so he uses 12-gram dart, very, very light. They call him the bullet. His hand is very quick going through. If you look at Ryan Searle, 34-gram darts, I believe, or 32s. Very, very lethargic at release. A very nice little soft flick. Both work great, but a different technique for a different weight dart. Or another good example would be Phil Taylor. So he started off using 22 grams, I believe. Then in the early 2000s, he moved up to 24. Then eventually he went to 25, then to 26. As his joints slowed down, he started to go up a few grams. So if your arm is quite relaxed and slow, maybe try something around 24 grams. If your arm is quite quick going through, maybe try 21 to 22. That's why I like 23, it's right in the middle. But no matter which set you pick, you can throw good darts with them. It's all technique. Technique and mindset. Get your technique right. If you don't get your technique right, your head won't be right. Get your technique right, get your head right, stick with them. Once you know you can throw good darts with them, it's about keeping the throw the same under pressure, not blaming the darts. It can be quite a painful process sticking with a dart after a big loss, but it's not the dart's fault. It never is. You do get the odd exception like Peter Wright, but he's an anomaly. He's the only world champion we've ever seen switch darts like that. And darts has been around a pretty long time at this point. First World Championship 1978. He's the only one. And so I think a lot of people these days look at him and think, oh, it's okay just to keep buying and swapping darts. Most of the time he uses a slim barrel dart. For most of his career he's used a slim barrel dart. Most of the things he's won have been with a similar balance and similar weight. And he is an anomaly. You don't want to be switching too much. If you look at all my signature darts I've had, they're all very similar. Even these darts, which I really like, and my signatures, very, very similar. If you look, I hold them right at the back, that grip and that grip, almost identical. The length, pretty much the same. The width, very similar. So if you are going to experiment with equipment, try to buy darts with a similar profile, weight and grip, at least. And lastly, in terms of the grip, try not to go too fancy. Normally these new fancy grips do not suit most people. You always find that one exception, but if you go to a darts tournament, or go to county or Super League even, anywhere where there's good dart players, most of them are going to be using a standard ring grip. Sometimes it'll have multiple rings like this. Sometimes the grooves will be bigger or smaller, but it's normally just a normal ring grip. These fancy ones they bring out these days, something like this, that grip's terrible. It's so inconsistent and I can barely feel it. It's worn off very, very quick. It actually feels like there isn't any grip on it now. And they're very expensive. That grip there in the centre is a lovely grip. Multi-ring grip. That's nice. The rings are slightly wider, which makes it a little bit more grippy. A little bit so the tissue start to get stuck in there. So it's pretty grippy. This, where the rings are a bit smaller, it's a lot less grippy. It still feels pretty good in the hand. If you like something really grippy and you want to try and go away from a ring grip, maybe try something like this, where it's got like a shark grip at the back. It's got like these little razors on the edge of it. That's a very aggressive grip, but if you can get them quite big and chunky, they won't wear off too quick, and the grip will last. If you go for very fine little shark grips, or razor grips, they're going to come off. And if you do buy razor grip, you want 90% tungsten. The fine edges will wear off within weeks. So those are the general rules. You have to pick for yourself, but it's all about feel and balance. Can you grip it? How's the balance playing? Is it giving you the angle into the board that you like? Are you struggling to force the angle? If you are, try something with a bit of a different balance to it. Maybe something longer, something shorter. And with tungsten percentage, it's more to do with the grip. If you have a more grippy dart, you want 90%. That's only 80%. It wears off very, very quick. This is 90%. It lasts a lot longer. If this dart had this amount of tungsten in it, it would last a lot better. Last thing to consider with tungsten percentage is that the higher the tungsten percentage, the narrower the dart can become. So if you're designing your own dart or you're looking for something very thin, you're going to want something longer and around 95% tungsten. That's going to get it as thin as possible. These days you can get like 23 gram darts that are about 52 mil long, 95% tungsten. They're literally going to be about 6.1, 6.2 mil wide. They're very, very narrow. Much more narrow than this. Anyway, it's all part of the journey. Actually experimenting with darts can be a lot of fun. But if you want to improve, you have to stick with them for a fair amount of time. Get the throw right. Then start trying different darts until your throw's right though. Stick with something basic. Something like this. That'll do the job. When your throw is right, you can start trying to find your own style. Get the fundamentals of the technique right, then try to develop your own style. When you develop your own style, looking at different darts can help. And it can be fun, it can be quite interesting. But even then, picking them up, having a few throws, putting them down, doesn't paint a full picture. You'll have a honeymoon period. The amount of times I've seen someone really struggling in the game, then they pick up someone else's darts off the table and they start going ton, ton, ton. And then, I'm going to get a set of these. These are the perfect darts for me. And then a week later, they start having the same problem with those darts that they had with their original darts, and then they want to switch back. It's not the dart, it's your timing. Something in your techniques change, usually the timing. Like I said, slightly faster for a lighter dart, slightly slower for a heavier dart. Now when you change the weight, if your timing's slightly out, so your wrist is going through a little bit too slow, then you go to a heavier set, it starts working. Then as you start to find your original throw, that heavier set doesn't work anymore. The problem wasn't with the dart, the problem was with your timing. And that can make the problem a lot worse. If you're using 26 one day and then 22 the next, you're always going to need a different timing to the throw. So you're never going to get consistent with it. But as long as it's within a gram, then you can normally adjust fairly quickly. But anyway, that's it for today. Thank you for watching Straight to the Point. Please remember to like and leave a comment, and as always, subscribe if you love the darts.